rising and popping that much on up above the surface, at least not in a very aggressive way. So just for Granzol, next time I make some, I'll measure it and I'll get back to you guys with that.
Yeah, I'd love to hear that. I think that would be fantastic to understand, because it would add some definition to that process that you described in how different it is from what other people are doing. It would start to actually give people a complete process. Like, if I keep it under this temperature, I have this time range that I can play in, and now I have a caramelization spectrum that I can work on, where what I'm doing, you definitely don't have nearly as much time. So
right.
What you can create with a process that you've got more time probably is a lot more varied than what I'm going to be able to do. And I'd love to hear that, because I intend to do some amount of Bochet work as a commercial producer. So I may need to take my game to the next level in how I caramelize my honey.
Well, we all see the pictures on Facebook where people put the different, that we've cooked it for this long and it looks this color, and the color wheel continues to get darker. I can, at the lower temperatures, I can go pretty deep into that color wheel and still not have any of that bitter taste that. Well, and I think, Vicki, you and I judged experimental last year, and just in my limited experience as a judge, that's always what is off-putting in most Bochets is that burnt note.
Yeah. Well, and the thing that I think that's happening, at least in some of them, is that they're you were saying about how they put here's what color it looks like, and they're putting little dots on the paper. Well, okay, that color is great and all, but if there's a burnt crust of honey at the bottom of the pot, that burnt crust is imparting that flavor into the honey that
that's true.
May or may not be evident. If they just stick their finger in the honey to see what it tastes like. And, when you taste like a little drop of it as opposed to, 2 gallons of it into a 5-gallon or 10-gallon batch, it's a whole nother animal. That's just, it's just like when you cook. I mean, I'm totally into cooking, and you can totally tell the difference between a chili that's been cooked in a pot where some is burnt to the bottom and one where it hasn't. There's a huge difference. Yep. And that's true of soups, that's true of sauces, that's true, so there's no reason why it wouldn't be true of honey as well. And, and I don't think they're taking that into account, because on the chat earlier, AJ pointed out that honey is going to burn at a much lower temperature. So, it's a juggling game to find the right temp to get the right thing, to get the right darkness level without it burning to the bottom and then off-putting those, outgassing those burnt notes that are going to put themselves in the honey and lurk there until you concentrate all of that and, ferment it. So
yeah, and as far as I've been able to tell, there are no thermometers like there are for white sugar that can tell you, hard crack, hard ball, soft ball, all that stuff. For honey, nobody knows any of that stuff.
The thing is, though, the temperatures will be the same because it's still sugar, but the problem is there's other things in the honey that start burning before you get to hard crack, which I learned when I was trying to make honey candy.
Right.
So it's the temperature. It's just you can't go by hard ball, hard crack, because you're going to burn before you get there.
Yeah, and
actually, I don't know if experimenting with putting small amounts of white sugar would maybe be kind of like putting olive oil in butter so that it doesn't burn.
I'm making the cross at you right now.
Well, yeah, actually, having done that, it does work. It increases the temperature you can get to before it starts to burn, but it still burns before you get to the same temperature as it would.
Right. Yeah, but what would happen when you make mead out of it, White sugar and mead.
Whoever's going to do the Bochet experiment and get themselves an AMMA grant can experiment with the temperatures and time variations at which honey Bochets.
Oh, certainly.
How not to burn your honey 101.
Yeah, whoever that is in the community, if anyone's listening and really wants to do that experiment, there's certainly one there.
There's money out there. We'll actually give you money to do this shit. So it's. Manny's like, I'm filling out the form. I'm not kidding. I mean, we really
writing a grant.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think if you do go to do a Bochet test, then if I'm going to set it up myself, what I'm going to do is get out my canning jars, and every stage at which I pinpoint a temperature and do a color and whatever test, I'm going to save some of the original batch in a jar for later tasting, so you can compare it all.
That's a really good idea. And, you made me think, too, and Manny said earlier, he said double boiler. Well, what about doing a water bath like you do with a canner?
Yeah.
There's no reason you couldn't. It's just going to take longer.
Well, yeah.
Yeah,
but
somebody mentioned that 2 weeks ago, if I remember correctly, in the Mead Makers group, and the response was pretty much what you just said, AJ, is that you could, but you're not going to get the caramelization action except over a long... Hey, if someone's got the time to try it, most certainly, but I kind of feels like it wouldn't be terribly effective.
There's got to be some middle ground to avoid that, burnt crust thing, because I think that's what's
There's
happening
only one
in the
way to
majority
find
of
out.
the Bochet's. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, there's lots of ways to find out.
Yeah.
Well, and truthfully, people are finding out. I know for a fact there are people out there that are cooking honey every week these days because the how popular the word Bochet is. We just don't have enough people reporting back on all the bad outcomes that they've had.
Well, and there's not any real rhyme or reason either. It's just people that are, sort of Bochetting randomly, and they're not, they're not really documenting results per se, and. My question to the guys that are putting out the pretty papers with the little, here's what it was at a half hour, here's what it was in 90 minutes, here's what it was in 2 hours, and so forth and so on. It's like, and how much honey was stuck to the bottom of the pot?
Here's the temperature. Yeah, well, also, this is the time, this is the temperature, and this is the sugar content. Those are the other things that you'd want to be putting in if you're going to take a scientific approach to it.
Exactly, yeah. You have to track
and if
all
you're
of
going
that.
to do this, then you do it once with straight honey, and then, try it once with half and half sugar.
Right. Plus
And if it's
varietals,
worth
you
it-
got to figure out which varietal is good and which is bad.
Well, yeah.
So
Yeah,
many
you're also
variables.
Yeah, you're going to do that with your base honey that you've got lots of, and then you're going to try it again doing bench size batches for each batch that you're going to try making of it.
The rate at which they achieve the level of Bochet that is desirable is going to vary depending on the varietal and the type of honey. But I think that just finding a way to caramelize honey, A, safely, B, in a timely fashion, and C, without leaving a burnt crust, would be a good,
and in an amount
would be a
that's
huge
reasonable.
step forward, and in an amount that's reasonable. Yeah, would be a huge step forward for the Bochet community. Which seems to be growing by leaps and bounds every day.
Yeah.
It's if we can achieve that much, then we're going to see the quality of Bochets go up by an exponential amount, and then from there we can start saying, okay, now if your honey has this much water content, do this. If it has this much water content, do that, and so forth and so on, to start dealing with some of the variables, Yep.
And I have a sense that while that's an awesome experiment, looking at all the other variables with the fermentation of honey that we don't have a good handle on, and since Bochets are one style of fermented honey, I suspect that we have a long list of things that we need grant proposals on, but and those are tough stuff because a lot of it requires measurement and rigor that I'm not going to say I have it. I'm not going to lie to everybody and say I have the rigor to do that. I'm a firm middle of the road blend of art and science, and that's what's driving my business too. Some of the stuff we're going to do, it's going to be within the context of a recipe, so it's completely legitimate. But there's going to be some swaying back and forth across the line there to make it work. But that's because the product is going to take us on its own little ride, and so I'm looking at my notes about Cizer, and I have a couple of other things.
Yeah, we did kind of go sideways into Bochets, didn't we?
We did.
This is not the Bochet episode. We'll do a different one for that.
Yeah, and I don't.
But we've only been doing it for an hour.
Yeah.
And I don't want them to be disappointed, because if they came here for Cizer and they go away without it, they might think badly of all of us for 2 or 3 seconds, until they take another sip, and then they probably won't care. But. So a couple of other things that occurred to me when Ryan and I had originally talked were, some people will ask about recipes, just like what's the construction of a Cizer, like what should be in it, and I have to say, after thinking about that particular question, I don't believe that I've ever made a cyser that didn't have cider as the only, liquid water content. But I could imagine trying to do, perhaps if you were looking to go on the session road, but you wanted to use a lot of honey, you may use water instead of cider because you needed some amount of liquid that didn't have sugar in it. And then I think, of course, you've got the scenario where you're adding other fruit, to co-ferment. So you're substituting some of the cider or some of the water for some other type of fruit. But I think that dominant recipe type is going to be the one where you add honey to your bucket and then you mix your cider with it. And you've pretty much, created a cider that has a lot of honey in it, and that's going to be the predominant fermentable. Anybody else have any other thoughts on other ways to construct a cyser?
I always go for full strength. So for me, it's apple juice. It's the cider, and then the honey, and and whatever yeast I decide to work with. But I was watching the conversation earlier on whichever group it was on that was about doing a session strength cyser. And yeah, that gets a little complicated because you've got to get that right dilution level and still keep that apple flavor in there.
Yeah. Yep. And
I was looking at that going, I'm just going to stick with 11-12% sizers.
Yeah, and that's where I don't feel like I've not done a session cyser. I mean, I've done ciders that have some honey in them to give some flavor to it, but the honey was a small enough quantity I wouldn't really call it a cyser because it the majority of the sugar would have been coming from the cider that was in it. But I would imagine you would substitute some of the cider for water, trying to cut that sugar content down. So
Paul's got a good suggestion. If you don't want too much alcohol in it, kill the yeast quick, and that'll leave you with something sweet.
Well, real sweet.
Yep.
Yeah, good luck with that.
Yeah, I know. Apple really, 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 really likes to ferment. Every time I've made cider, I've had to either sulfite it or hit it with K1V in order to not have the wild yeast doing the job for me.
Yep.
Well, and I don't think very many people would say that you can stop a fermentation midstream very successfully.
You'd have to practically freeze it out.
Yeah, it's for me. It's a roll of the dice all the time. I don't even try to play with that anymore. I just I go dry and build back up if that's what I'm looking for, or I go beyond the yeast alcohol tolerance, knowing that it's going to land somewhere in a sweet range. Depending on how well I've fed the yeast, it'll. I mean, I'll exceed an alcohol tolerance range pretty much every single time I make a strong mead these days, just because the nutrition regimen is so good that the yeast just keeps cranking. It's healthier and more viable than it would be without it. So the alcohol's not really phasing it nearly as much.
So what are you doing? Back sweetening afterwards with honey, or?
Yeah, so anything that's below a reasonable alcohol tolerance of even the lowest ABV tolerant yeast out there. Mm-hmm. I'll let it go dry, stabilize it, and then bring it back with, and depending on what I'm making, it can be a combination of whole fruit or fruit juice and then honey, depending on how much sugar I'm looking to add. I've had really good luck this last iteration with some of the session meads in being able to add just whole fruit after it's been stabilized and get both flavor and sugar to a very pleasurable result where I'm not adding honey back in, so you don't have any of that unfermented honey flavor, even a subtle. It's just not there because there isn't any unfermented honey.
Because you're using fruit to back sweeten. That's a neat idea.
Yeah, and it I didn't used to be able to, and I'm not sure what I'm doing differently now. I didn't used to be able to do that. It tasted good enough, so I've made some other changes to my session mead protocols with some enzymes and stuff like that. So I'm guessing I'm creating a finished mead that is a little bit more characterful, maybe a little bit more body, a little bit more viscosity to it, so that when I put the fruit in it, that sugar is being boosted by some other components in the mead itself. So